welcome you to this session where we have collaborated in this project of research, when I say the two that I mentioned. And last night there was a session for the unions and their organization, workers' organizations actually. Today we'll be hosting the faith-based organizations under the United Umbrella. And when we look at Monday, God's willing, we will be looking at also the broader collaboration from the teachers, because in this project we have a number of stakeholders from the different angles that we would need. I'm not going to go into much details because I guess you will hear from each speaker, but for us it's also a privilege to have with us Mr. I almost call him Doctor also, but I believe in some title that he would earn just now, Nils Kastberg. He is the former UNICEF Caribbean and Latin America director. He comes with a wealth of experience, and it is a privilege to, during this period, a gentleman with very, very busy agenda, to have him here personally in St. Martin to help us with the works that needs to be done as preparatory for whatever funding, whatever project, and whatever needs we have, so that we can make sure that no one is left behind.
And I'm just here to welcome you all and also inform you of the fact that since I've come on board and since the Dean, Dr. Rolinda Carter, has come on board in May of last year, we've had the mandate to make the University of St. Martin the University of the people of St. Martin. So this place is not only a place where young people go to school, get their degree, and go look for a job thereafter. This is a place for critical thinking, for thinking about our society. It's a place where there's a diversity of ideas. It's a place where we want to conduct research, and we want to promote education and research for the community. Because we believe that here, in this space where we can think, we can also dialogue and talk. And we can talk from different perspectives, and we can also think about where we want our St. Martin to go. Coincidentally, though I cannot represent any faith or religion, but coincidentally, the Dean of Academics is a sister in Christ. I was born and raised in the gospel as well, and I've always used that faith as inspiration to contribute to the change that we need in the world. For me, the most fundamental laws that I recognize is that of loving our Almighty Father and loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. And if I think about what my faith has taught me, my faith has taught me to walk humbly, to love one another, and to do justice. And so today we're going to hear from our highly esteemed guest, who is no stranger to St. Martin. And we're going to think about what we can do as people of faith, together with other organizations of civil society organizations here in St. Martin, like the trade unions when we met yesterday, but also the university, other organizations of the anti-poverty platform, and hopefully the communities of faith can make a very important contribution to thinking about poverty, to thinking about the children of St. Martin, to thinking about the rights of children of St. Martin. Thank you all for coming, and I trust that we're going to have a very fruitful day. Thank you.
I would like to continue to say the St. Martin Anti-Poverty Platform is a collaboration that started in 2011 between the Windward Island Chamber of Labor Unions, the St. Martin Pensioners and Seniors and Pensioners Association, and the NGOs combined in the Sunfed. I am a coordinator, and I would now like to call on the other coordinator, Mr. Raymond Gizu, to give a little brief explanation on the cooperation and the history of this project. Mr. Gizu, Raymond, please now take you through that.
Thank you. I welcome you as a brother in Christ. When you hear St. Martin Anti-Poverty Platform and you read and you see, then you see a brother of Christ addressing a social problem. And I opened this session by telling you 3 weeks ago, a leader of the congregation telling me, Brother Cicero, you're doing a good job. Continue. And I asked the brother, why you say you? I thought it should be we are doing a good job. Put him to think. He said, actually you're right, you know. Now that set the tone for today. Because when we as St. Martin Anti-Poverty started, we had meetings with the Council of Churches. We had meetings with the St. Martin United Ministerial Foundation. And all with the objective, how can we work together, how can we collaborate to reach the poor and the needy? It is in Proverbs 31st, the 31st chapter, verse 8, that I got my instruction. Speak out on behalf of the poor and the needy. So yes, you will hear me speak out. And all you will hear is what they are confessing, what they are sharing with us. Speak out on behalf of them. They asked it. There's a lot of fear. They don't want to come in front of a camera, but they want me to do it. And I changed the meaning. Why they ask me? And why is it that they don't ask we to do it? So maybe for today, let that be the reflection that we are going to do together. Because there is a lot of children in this society that have to come to Jesus, have to know Jesus. And what is our contribution in that? Now, how come we started with the children in this project? Was because we did a documentary 1 year after Irma. And the documentary was with the adults, of course, parents of families. And they shared us their needs, which was not because of the hurricane, was worse because of the hurricane, because they were in poverty already before the hurricane. When we were in Dutch Quarter, when we were in St. Peter's, when we were in the different neighborhoods, making the documentary, what you hear was, we need help. And so, what we did was actually bring it out 1 year after Irma, still help needed. But then, the children, nobody actually took time to listen to the children, to sit with the children. And so we took the initiative to bring also the children on board, to listen to them and to see what we can do for them. Because the future of St. Martin is not only for me and for you, it's also for them. And I don't know how much time the Lord will give me still among you. But what we know as a senior citizen already, it looks like time is almost up here for me to go home. But if we want to make St. Martin home for all the children, for all the people, all the migrants that is coming into our islands, how are we treating them? All these mothers of children that tell you about their pain, you have to look for being father, being mother, being all kinds of things together. And then these children that give a mouth cry, that a lot of us don't understand, how they look for attention. On the front page of the newspaper, we look at it. On Facebook, we look at it. How they want the attention. In fights, in who's stronger, who does this, who's does that. We would like to see it become different. Talking with them, we hear that they have wishes, that they have desires. And so I think that by reflecting upon that today, what can we do together? This project is what we call an action research project. We have an idea of what is cooking, but we have to verify. So that's where the research starts. But we also want to make the information that we gather useful for the society by bringing it back to others that didn't know. And also, because we talk about children, there are things that they don't know yet. For instance, they have rights. Now, you cannot talk about are all your rights fulfilled? And tomorrow, will that be also a prosperous tomorrow if you do not reflect with them of what is already possible, what is already available? So we want to bring that too. That's why we would like to see the teachers on board, because we entrust a lot of our children to teachers during the day. So we will be gathering with them also to see how we can involve them in transmitting what is the best for all of us. What is it that, and especially now coming back to the faith-based community, what is it that Jesus wants from all of us? For them to know. Now, I know you know a lot of scripture, but today let us reflect on how to practice religion, how to practice our faith, how to bring this faith in action in such a way that it can bring about a change. Now, the research that we want to do together with the university is actually to document that, to help, to visualize that, to guide that. And we have even a hope that it might be an example for the world. Because there's so many people from the world coming in here. We boast as a tourism island that we have more than 100 nationalities in our island. So let us see how we go about. Well, God, when He created us, was one, mankind. Right? And so, where we know that we will have in heaven all the nationalities, we also know to reach there, there's something that we have to do. We have to make known that Jesus loves them too. We have not only to make known that Jesus loves them, but we have to portray that, we have to see that in the community that we serve. So we thank, first of all, as the Anthropological Platform, the university, for opening this opportunity for us to assist us in serving the community, to focus more on the needs of those in the community that are crying out. What would Jesus do? WWGD. I leave you with that. WWGD. Can we help to fill in these words? What would Jesus do? And this is the start of not the first and the last session, but a start for us to do more sessions in this trajectory of the project that we will be finalizing during these weeks that come in. Well, with the help of Nils, I have to tell you, from the moment that we wanted to start the pilot with the children from the parents in the documentary, he immediately, within 24 hours, served us by providing us with a guideline to have the interviews with the children. That part is documented. We have to thank for that part our recorder of today, Mr. Ricardo William. He has been very instrumental in making this information known to others, and we can use it, and you can use it in your congregations, in your organizations, for other people also to see what children think, what they see, and what we can do to bring them to the next level too. So with that said, this is what, as Anti-Poverty Platform, we have embarked on together with the USM, and we are so happy that Nils, as our co-coordinator, said, yes, I'm willing to come. And I have to tell you, he didn't charge. He did it all for free. And by saying that, it's not that you have to know what your right hand does, but it's just to show you, how is it possible that someone from Sweden, right, can go all over the world, is being asked all over the world, but still found it in that schedule suitable to come back to St. Martin. That is something we have that he alone can tell us. And so, with that said, I can only tell you, be a good listener. And for the second half of the day, when we have the workshop, become part of the action. What can we do? What would Jesus do? What we should do so that the children can be better off in this society.
You have the floor, and welcome again. After hearing Raymond's word, I don't need to introduce you, but you can have the floor for now.
Thank you. Do I need the microphone for the... I can leave it there. Perfect. Well, I'm privileged to be here and to meet with all of you. And I understand that today I'm meeting persons of faith, so I'm meeting sisters and brothers. So that means I don't need to go in and read the Bible. I can quote it directly to you. You already know the Bible. And I also would like to say something. You can forget everything I say, but remember Scripture. And whatever we are talking from Scripture, that's what I wanted to remember. Firstly, I think that this collaboration between persons of faith and the university and trade unions seems, at first appearance, what a strange collaboration. And still, I think it's a very clever one. And I think you need to make sure that you support it in different ways, and God will lead you in that regard. But we have been called to be light. And I was saying this morning, meeting some brothers, that sometimes we gather all the light inside the church, and all the candles end up burning each other. And the light actually is supposed to be on top of the hill, not inside. If anything, we encourage, we turn on the light of the candles, but they are supposed to be out there. And we have a lot of young people, whether in universities, whether in work, whether in ministries, wherever they may be, that's where you're supposed to be the light. How you do that light? Well, Jesus himself told us, innocent on the one hand, but astute on the other. He told us, and that includes sometimes using a language the way Jesus used language. Jesus, when he spoke to people, he didn't use religious language. When you read scripture, you can see on the reaction of the people that he was using a language that they were not expecting from a religious or a faith or a rabbi. He spoke differently, and on top of that, he spoke with authority. So that is a call for us that we might use a celestial language among ourselves in a church, but when we go outside the church, we're called to follow not our traditions, but the example of Jesus. And Jesus, he wanted to speak in such a way that people could understand him. Now, in university language, this is called social action research. In celestial language, we are looking for which is the lost sheep. Most politicians, they talk about how many they are already reaching. And any politician that can say, I reach 99% of the population of St. Martin with what they need, that politician thinks, I'm the most successful politician. And still Jesus didn't say, I have reached 99% of my sheep. No, he went out to look for the one sheep. So when we talk about the platform, anti-poverty platform, when we talk about social action research, what is it for? It's for looking for the lost sheep. And regretfully, we have many more than one out of 100. Jesus said it's worth it for just 1%. Regretfully here, it's almost the other way around. I saw somewhere we are talking about over 90% of the children affected in parts of the island because of poverty. Those are the type of figures that we need the university to help us with. But it makes it even more urgent whom we are supposed to reach. Now, the Millennium Development Goals were replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which run from 2015 to 2030. 30 years ago, politicians, presidents, they were thinking about how big ships they would have, what better harbor, what highways they were going to build, that type of thing. Over the past 19 years, we have had a change where suddenly politicians start holding themselves accountable that we have to reduce poverty, we have to reduce hunger, we have to reduce the number of mothers that die, we have to reduce the number of children that die from preventable reasons. That 40 years ago, when I was small and started working around the world, politicians, at cocktail parties and so on, they were discussing about their big hotels, their big infrastructure, having an airline, having a bigger airport. They were not talking about the fact that so many children were dying. Now, if we compare with 1990, in 1990, 30 million children were dying every year from very preventable reasons. They were dying from malaria, they were dying from measles, they were dying from respiratory infections, and they were dying from malnutrition, diarrhea, basically. Basically because you are drinking poor water, that leads to diarrhea, that weakens you, and because you are already weak, you die. Those 30 million children were dying. How many churches were aware that 30 million babies were dying under the age of 5. Now that has been reduced to around 7 million a year. Still, 7 million a year is an enormous number of children. And still, a significant number of them are dying from preventable reasons. Now, let me ask one question. Do you think that it is of concern to God that 7 million children are dying every year? I would think so. And if it is of concern to him, it should be of concern to us. And we can read in the Bible how God gets angry, even with his own people. You can read the prophets, how angry God gets at how, his own people are oppressing people, are not thinking about the poor, and so on. And that's where we need a greater clarity as persons of faith about the centrality of the justice of God. In Isaiah 61:8, it says, I, God, love justice. Now that's not the only place where God speaks about this. Now, we have a difficulty with English. Those of you who speak Spanish or speak French, you are used to the fact that the Bible and that concept from the Hebrew and from Aramaic that we are using is justicia, justice. But in English, sometimes it is translated righteousness. Righteousness captures part of justice, but it doesn't capture the full concept of the justice of God. And we need to be aware, because sometimes we go into the King James Version and we say, this is the perfect version. Well, there is no perfect version. And we need many different versions to help us attain the greatest possible clarity. Is it a very profound translation? Yes. But words are words. They don't capture the whole totality of the concept. And that's where we need to sometimes compare. And for those of us who are multilingual, it's actually very good to look at different languages, but also different Bible versions. I was telling my brother, every year I try to read a new version of the Bible, either in Spanish, in Swedish, in English, and I rotate. I have my basic sort of learning of the Bible. I learned to read the Bible in Spanish because I was small. My parents were missionaries in Paraguay, and I wanted to read the Bible. So I learned to read at 3-4 years of age by going and asking my mother, what does this letter mean, and so on. And I was doing it on the Bible. So that's my basis. But I enrich, my understanding of every Bible verse by looking at different versions. So coming back to the question of righteousness, when you read righteousness very often, it means justice in the very broader sense, not just of you being right with God, but you being right with your fellow man and creating a society that is right. And you can understand that by looking at how the prophets talked. They talked about, they went and talked to the king. This is not right. A society that oppresses the poor, that's not right. You are having a lot of people here in prison. They shouldn't be there. And so on. They are very, very clear that God is just. We can see it also in the Psalms, and I don't need to reemphasize, but I just wanted to point that out. I know you know it, but I think it's very important to refresh our. Now, the Bible then talks to us constantly about a number of injustices. Many of them include things that we see today in our society. It talks about corruption, deviating through money the courts, and so on. But the four most common injustices that the Bible talks about from Deuteronomy, and you can see it even earlier than Deuteronomy, and all the way to James, the four classical injustices that really make God angry, and you can read about it. The anger of God before these injustices are the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the stranger who is badly treated. Now, if there's something that makes God angry, we should pay notice. We should pay notice. Now, we have never in history had so many of these four. We have never had so many poor. We have never had so many widows. We have never had so many orphans. We have never had so many people on the move. And I say people on the move, I don't say refugees, because the Bible has a wider definition of migration and of refugees. And I will touch on it during the morning, because I think it's good we go through some of these, because sometimes we drink in what the media serves us and what politicians serves us, but are we following the example of Jesus, or are we following culture? And I think it's very important that we are completely clear where we stand. We want to be followers of Jesus, not followers of culture. Now, therefore, when we talk about social action research, we are actually talking about the injustices that the Bible talks about. And we are talking about the lost sheep. Now, when we come to the university and we meet the president of the university, we might not say we want to look for the lost sheep. But we might say, would you be willing to join an anti-poverty platform? But the purpose of the anti-poverty platform is actually to look for the lost sheep. And it is to try to start dealing with some of the four main injustices that God is constantly mentioning. Please don't take that as being the only ones. If you go through the Bible, you find how God gets so angry on so many issues. But those four are particularly repeated frequently, and we even have it all the way down to James. Now, orphans. How come we have more orphans than ever? How come we have more widows than ever? Well, I can give you some statistics from Latin America. In Latin America, if you go to all the Villa Miserias, the favelas, the poorest neighborhoods of all the mega cities, 80%, more than 80% of the family units have only one adult, and in the majority of the cases, that adult is not a man, it's a woman. So, we have widows. They might be on paper married, or they might supposedly have a spouse, unmarried spouse, but that spouse has disappeared. That man has disappeared. In fact, the present minister of education here in St. Martin, he held a number of workshops around the economic consequences of the fact of the absent father. And I remember us inviting him to Station to give a statement, not because he was a pastor, but because he had done so much research around the economic consequences of a family unit where the father is missing. Now, the moment you have an absent father, you have a widow. And you have an orphan. And you say, no, but they have the mother. No, but it's... Well, firstly, the definition of an orphan is when one of the parents, you don't need to miss both. When you miss one of the parents, you're orphan. That's the social science definition. But that's perfectly consistent with the Bible. Because who should every child have? They should have a father and they should have a mother. So obviously, here we have a correlation between social science and a biblical principle. We use different terminology, but as Christians, we might wish to use, when we speak to the university, the social science language, but we know this is consistent with the Bible. So, we are called upon to deal with this. Poverty. We have two types of poverty. Only now is social science starting to recognize that you cannot just measure well-being in terms of your per capita income. Even the World Health Organization has now adapted the definition of health to include the total well-being of you. So it's not just the absence of disease, but it's your general well-being. This is totally consistent with the words of Jesus. I have come so that you may have life and life in abundance. That abundance is not necessarily a pecuniary, a monetary well-being. He is looking, although that may be included in it, but he is above all wanting you to feel that you are mentally and physically and spiritually in good order, and abundantly so. So again, very often secular people think that, well, the Bible people, they are so way behind, and so on, no? When actually, if we start looking, already 2,000 years ago, and even earlier, the concepts of social science were so well articulated in the Bible. But have we practiced it? The stranger. So I talked about the widow, I talked about the orphan, I talked about the poor. Look at the concept. Actually, I should add a few points. If you look at the Old Testament, when you were harvesting, you were not supposed to turn and pick up the little pieces, of your straws that fell off you. You were supposed to leave that. And you were never supposed to harvest all the way to the edges. You were supposed to leave the edges. So that the poor people that didn't have land, that didn't have access, to the capital to produce things, they would be able to go there and get food. And in fact, if you read Ruth, the owner of the land, he went and told his workers, you treat her well. Okay, he might have been in love with her, but we still have the point there of telling your workers, the one who comes to harvest the edges of the field and whatever you drop, you treat her well. And drop a little extra for her. That was the attitude towards the poor. And we could go through other examples in the Bible. We have Joseph and how he administered when he was basically the number 2 in Egypt. But rather than going through, I'm simply emphasizing why an anti-poverty platform might be secular words for profoundly biblical concepts, and therefore very important responsibility for us to be engaged. The stranger. I was just looking up, I'll go and get here. It's very interesting. The definition of a refugee in the secular world has its origin in the 1951 Refugee Convention. And it establishes that a refugee is if one of you is persecuted or has a well-grounded fear of persecution. That's how it was defined that you were a refugee in 1951. That's the 1951 Convention. What happened? Already in the 60s in Africa, you had a lot of situations where you might not have been individually persecuted. But suddenly there was an upheaval, there were rebels, there was an army coming, and they were going to attack your village. Did you wait there until you were personally persecuted? No, you fled. Because you knew devastation was coming to your village. You were not individually persecuted, but there was a generalized violence. So the African nations agreed to a convention that accepted the 1951 convention, but added the definition that if you fled from generalized violence, you could also be considered a refugee. So the Western countries, they were very happy to tell the African nations that's very fine in terms of applying that definition in Africa. We will not apply it in Europe or in the US, but we will we will continue contributing to you when you help people who flee from generalized violence. So you see how the hypocrisy starts coming into, how they act in the Western countries. Then Latin America, in the late 70s, they had dictatorships around here. In fact, all Latin American countries except 3 were dictatorships. So you had a lot of refugee movements. Now, they might not have been individually persecuted. And they might not have escaped from generalized violence. But basically, the way the government was operating made it unlivable for them. So then a number of lawyers gathered in Cartagena, and they expanded the refugee definition a little bit further, so that it would include systematic violations of human rights. So, why am I going into this level of detail? Because the Bible definition of a refugee is so much broader. It covers the Venezuelans leaving Venezuela right now, over 3 million. The world has difficulties knowing exactly under what type of definition the Venezuelans, they all recognize that they have very valid reasons to flee. But they don't know exactly under what category to put it. But for all human beings, those that are fleeing from Venezuela are really fleeing from desperate situations. Now, look at Solomon, how he viewed it. He was praying, and he said, "As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. When they come and pray towards this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place. Do whatever the foreigner asks you, so that all the people of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. Interesting how he was looking at the issue of foreigners. He was seeing it as many people will come from distant lands because, because of your great name, your mighty hand, your outstretched arm. What does that mean in secular language? A country that is much better off than where they are. That's called pull factor nowadays, very often. And mighty hand, you might be very powerful, you feel safe there. Your outstretched arm, you receive help when you arrive there. This is almost unthinkable language for a politician today. Which politician would speak like this? But this was Solomon's language. So again, I'm trying to use these 4 examples. I could use many more, but I wanted to touch on these 4 because social sciences and social action, and the president of the university, I'm sure, can enrich us more on that either today or later. But social action in the end is trying to see how can we move from here to here in terms of improving the situation, both in terms of social relations and in terms of the well-being of people. What is that in biblical language? Looking for the lost sheep. So should we be part of it? Of course. Of course we have to be part of it. And of course, learning from the example of Jesus, we're supposed to use a language that people can understand. So I cannot necessarily use what I have in Scripture. I have to translate what is here so that the public can understand. I'm not supposed to come with a heavenly language. If I speak to young people, you will be covered by the blood of Jesus. Well, if they are not used to this, they will say, is this guy crazy? And how often isn't it that we fall into a pattern, a tradition of speaking that we learned in the church, and we forget that Jesus was constantly thinking, how do I speak so that the publican can understand? He wasn't speaking so that the Pharisees necessarily will understand. So what language we use in the church for our mutual, uplifting might not be the language that we should use outside if we want to be light. If I'm using a language that the others don't understand, even Paul says, and okay, he's talking about speaking in tongues, but here our language in the churches has become a speaking in tongues. And Paul says, how would it look like if somebody that is a stranger to your community, and he was emphasizing this because he was not talking to Jews, he was talking to the broader community, and they didn't have a shared understanding of the Scriptures. Here you had people that had no clue, of the Old Testament. They were Gentiles. So he says, how do you think they will think if they come into your congregation and you are using a language they don't understand? They think you are crazy, and they will go out and they will not come back. Paul is already telling us that, reinforcing. So, sorry for spending this much time, but I think it's very important that we recognize that when we talk about social action and anti-poverty platform, though that might be a secular language, to sound something that is profoundly biblical. It's just that we're using a different language. Now, I did start off by saying God says, I love justice. We don't see it only in Isaiah, we can see it also in the Psalms. Psalm 83, Psalm 85 talks in a beautiful way about the issues of justice, at the same time that it talks about the importance of mercy and grace, and how they meet the importance of the meeting of the justice and the grace in the marketplace and so on. So the Psalms highlight this. And in fact, if we look at the issues of justice, we see it more frequently talked about in the Bible than even salvation. And justice is so much the essence of God that he was willing to send his Son because he is so just. So that's how fundamental the issues of justice is. So we need to get into our soul a little bit more of the conviction and of the anger of God when he sees injustice. The anger of Jesus against hypocrisy with the Pharisees. He didn't lash out that way against Zacchaeus. He didn't lash out against the publicans or Matthew in that way. He was more angered about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. So, again, things that we need to keep in mind as we embark in being part of changing St. Martin's in a fundamental way. Now, human rights. You have heard many times that word. Well, firstly, it is rights that makes us human. Otherwise, we are like animals in the jungle. Whoever is the strongest is the one that wins. So, what puts us on a different scale than the animals are the human rights that we treat each other. Now, that's a secular language for a profoundly biblical concept of how we should treat each other. Now, we need to build a floor of rights. Sometimes many people see the question of human rights as a ceiling towards which you are striving towards. Actually, human rights are like each of these tiles on the floor. You know, vaccinating a child, making sure that the children get vaccinations so that they don't die of a preventable disease. That's one tile of that floor of rights. Another one, that they can get education. And another one has to do with making sure the mother doesn't die when giving birth. You know, Isaiah 65:20 says, on that day, no child shall die after a few days. Even in the Old Testament, you have that longing of not having a situation where so many children are dying after just a few days. These are not empty words. These are words that need to really hit us. Blessed he who reads, says Apocalypse 1:3. It was actually the revolution about learning to read in the UK, in Great Britain, was driven by Christians because they wanted to read the Bible. And they felt everybody should read the Bible, so everybody needs to go to school. And sometimes we forget that Christians were part of that for a profoundly biblical reason. Blessed he who reads. How will you read Scripture? How will you... It also tells us a number of additional things. It tells us of those that ignored. Now, I need to illustrate for you how strong the example of Jesus was. Because he was talking to people of Jewish faith. And for him to say, the priest passed by and the Levite passed by, but it was the Samaritan who stopped. It was more or less like for many, if you said, well, you know, a married man passed and a widow passed and they ignored him, but the homosexual stopped and helped. No, it was, you could use different examples to illustrate, but Jesus was trying to say the least you expected to help was the one that actually helped this man. Now, what is that called? That's called the charity approach. You choose yourself whether you put your money in your pocket to help somebody, or whether you stop on the road and help this man that has fallen on the side of the road. That's an act of charity. What is important in an act of charity? What is important is the attitude with which you do that. Because if you have somebody begging and you take a coin and you sort of throw it to him, you know, you are breaking down his God-given dignity. It would have been better if you had gone to him and said, I'm sorry I didn't have any cash with me, but I love you. That would have meant so much more to this person than just throwing him a coin like this. So in an act of charity, that's why it is called an act of charity, an act of love. The love has to be unadulterated. Now then there is the second toolbox of how you can help people. And that's the needs approach. This Samaritan example is very good because he didn't stop there. He helped him until full recovery. Which means he didn't just give him the coin or the help to get up from the roadside and then leave him on the road. He actually helped his whole recovery. He took them to a place where he could recover, and he even assumed a financial responsibility for that recovery phase. That's the needs approach. The difference between the charity approach and the needs approach is that you are assuming a responsibility for meeting a certain set of needs. In the charity approach, you do something that you happen to be able to do at that moment, and you should do it with the best possible attitude. But in the needs approach, you assume a longer-term responsibility in terms of ensure a full recovery. But the third approach is the rights approach. In the rights approach, you are not just helping a few, you are trying to establish the floor of rights. You don't want disparities, differences, that some have access to education, some don't. Some have access to a certain type of social services, others don't. You establish a floor. Do we have examples of that in the Bible? It's full of it. Look at some of the prophets. Instead of creating a children's home, they went to the king and they said, why is this happening to the children? What is happening to the widows? What were they doing? They were trying to influence the public policy. Public policy is what they were doing. When Jonah went to Nineveh, he didn't get close to Nineveh and create a refugee camp for all those that were going to flee the destruction of Nineveh. He went in there and he preached and he changed the mindset. He influenced the public policy, the way of thinking of the whole people. From the government to the people, they changed their way of thinking. Sometimes we are too quick at creating a project instead of going and influencing the policy. Sometimes we might even be in collusion with the government instead of going up and saying, this is what's needed. Now, if we're going to have an anti-poverty platform, we need to know what we're going to say. That's why we ally ourselves with the university, we ally ourselves with faith-based leaders who know their communities, who know what they are seeing in terms of the hardships that children are facing, etc., etc. What will our child remember? And you probably remember one or another thing, nice thing that you did with your father. That thing might have lasted 1 hour, or half an hour, or 5 minutes. He gave you a particularly good hug, or you went out on a boat, I don't know, some nice memory that might have been very, very short in time, and still, 40, 50 years later, you're still remembering it. It's part of your bank account of good memories from the time. So Jesus hugged, caressed, and what did he do then? He blessed them. So here he's holding them. Now, if I'm blessing you, you're my daughter, and I'm hugging you, I'm caressing you, will I bless you by looking the other way? I would be looking you in the eye. If I try to sell, I usually use that example, if I try to sell to you a used car, and I tell you how beautiful my Volvo is, 1983, very old and still running like a clockwork, but I don't dare to look you in the eye. Would you trust me? Something fishy. This guy doesn't look me in the eye and he's talking about selling me this car. I don't think I can trust him. How do you build the confidence of your child, the self-esteem of your child? Through eye contact. What does the blessing, Aaron's blessing, how does it say? How does it read? Let's look at, is it Numbers? Numbers, is it 6? Or is it, no, I think it's 4. Who can help me find the Aaronic blessing? Number 6. Sorry?
Number 6,
22. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you
my
Please.
It says, God bless you and keep you. God smile on you and gift you. God look you full in the face and make you prosper. I mean, this is another course.
Yeah. Now read any of the versions. Is that how you treat your child? This is how God the Father is treating us. So we should take cue from this for how we will shine. Now, from social science, we know that the average time that a mother is looking into her child's eye, and a father, on average, is around 11 minutes a day. And that would be a very good family. In many cases, it's less. And I will not ask you personally how much time you spent looking into your child's eye. But look, God wants to look at us. He wants to see us. He wants to be radiant. Now, of those 11 minutes, how many of those minutes were minutes used to reprimand? Is a child getting used that when you look the child in the eye is for a reprimand rather than for building them up? Now, we recognize that we are full of faults. So we need God to be merciful with us. And we need Him to look us radiantly into our eyes because we feel so depressed by all our weaknesses. Now, how will our children learn that attitude unless we practice it? So, again, the eye contact is fundamental. And then He blessed them. In Spanish, many of you understand Spanish. To bless means to speak good words. Bendecir, bien decir, to say good things. Obviously, He wants to help you. He has a purpose with your life. Since before you were born, He wants to use you. Those are positive words that are building up this child. Are those the words, or are we mal decir? Are we speaking bad words? What words are we speaking to our children? What tone? What atmosphere? Is it this radiant face that God wants to turn towards us? Are we blessing or are we cursing our children? Now, we have sometimes here in the Caribbean heard the expression, spare the rod spoils the child. Nils Kastberg, former regional director of UNICEF for Latin America and the Caribbean, and presently director of the board of Special Olympics International, also director of the board of a foundation called La Ventana de los Cielos, south of Miami, and also board member for the Swedish Medical Mission, which is an NGO based in Sweden. And I teach at the Faculty of Law in Barcelona, in Spain, once a year for a week. So, and then I undertake a number of different missions around the world.
Okay, tell me, you said that you travel around the world to give do a lecture. So various people are invited. What are some of the topics that you deal with?
Well, I have concentrated a lot around trying to build the capacity of faith leaders around human rights, knowledge of human rights from the biblical perspective, and the dialogue between international organizations like the UN and the faith community. I've done that in Congo, in different parts of Congo, eastern Congo. I've done that in Burundi, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, in Kenya, and I've also done it in Paraguay, in Argentina, and in Ecuador, and in different parts of the Dutch Caribbean. So that's one area. Second area focuses around the exclusion of persons living with mental conditions and syndromes. They belong to the weakest because they cannot defend themselves. And still, they are the most discriminated and badly treated group in the world, about 300 million of them living under extreme exclusion in most parts of the world. In the Western world, over medicalization, instead of giving them half an hour of love when they have a tantrum, they get an injection or they get a pill that sedates them and makes it very difficult for them to develop. And in many countries of the South, they are hidden away in a room, not seen, not given opportunities to develop. So that's a second focus. A third focus has been the question of children and violence in the relations between couples, because that's very much on the increase, and we need to seek to reduce the enormous increase of violence against children, and sexual abuse is part of that picture.
Now you're here in St. Martin at the university giving a lecture about, the way of living, poverty, and crime, and behavior of teenagers. How is that going so far?
I've been very pleasantly surprised by the positive response of the audience, both from the trade unions, as well as from faith leaders, as well as from the faculty staff of the St. Martin's University. So clearly there was a need to talk about these issues. I don't think I'm inventing the wheel, but providing the opportunity to discuss these issues in such different fora, faith leaders, university people, and workers' unions, shows that this is an issue that is close to the heart of the St. Martin's people. And the reason I've come is to see how I can support those interested around what they call an anti-poverty platform. How do we bring different parts of civil society and the government around an issue of making sure that children don't continue living in poverty? And I think it's very wise. The earlier we can reach them, the better development possibilities they have. And I'm very keen on how can we reach children in time, how can we reach teenagers in time. Another topic obviously is teenagers, which you mentioned earlier, and I think we need to find new ways of interacting with teenagers. Most societies around the world have difficulties relating with teenagers, whether it is in the home, whether it is in the school, whether it is in the church, whether it is in other places. The relationship between adults and teenagers tends to be problematic, and there are things there that we should take into account so that we can have toolbox of life on how to relate with them.
Now, how did you get invited to St. Martin? Because St. Martin is a very tiny island. You barely could find it. Wow. How did you get to be here on the whole island?
I've been invited in the past to be keynote speaker at the Kingdom Conference in 2014 in Aruba, where prime ministers from Curaçao, Aruba, and St. Martin were present, as well as from the governors from Bonaire, Save and Statia, and authorities from the Netherlands. And after that, I've been invited on a few missions, both to Save and Statia, St. Martin, Aruba, and Curaçao, Bonaire as well. And I think here in St. Martin they had heard of me and got in touch, and I must say I love St. Martin, and I love seeing people interested in changing their reality. And because of what people here in St. Martin suffered with the Hurricane Irma and Maria, I felt that it was important to come and see how I could be of help in this regard.
Any special things that, before we wrap up this interview, that you would like to say to the parents, especially about how the young generation, because you talked a lot on that today.
Yes, arrive on time. Give them your love. Look at them. See them in their eye. Caress them. Give them hugs. All of that. Start with that when they are newborn, and keep doing it. It's too late to start trying to do it when they are 10 years old if you have not done it before. So just remember, arrive on time with your affection and with your love. And remember, your eyes looking at your child should be for building them up. Your words for your children should be building them up, making them feel better, building their self-esteem, not knocking them down. And your touch should be one that comforts them, not one that hits them. So work on those things, and you will see that your children will grow up to be wonderful citizens.